It was the most predictable catastrophe in the history of the global energy market. And the world walked into it anyway. The International Energy Agency characterized what followed as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The head of the IEA went further, calling it directly the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Those are not phrases economists reach for lightly. They are the vocabulary of systemic rupture. And to understand how the world arrived here, oil above $126 a barrel, 20,000 mariners stranded in the Persian Gulf, families in Bangladesh rationing electricity and shutting universities early, you have to go back much further than February 28, 2026. You have to go back to the moment a nuclear program crossed the line that every Western intelligence agency had been watching for years. The chain began in 2015. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, was the most intrusive nuclear verification agreement the world had ever negotiated. Iran committed to capping uranium enrichment at 3.67% purity, dismantling 2/3 of its centrifuges, and accepting daily inspections from the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. In exchange, the United States and the European Union lifted the sanctions that had cut Iranian oil exports by over 1 million barrels per day. The deal was held for 3 years. Then, in 2018, the United States withdrew. Iran responded, slowly at first, then in deliberate, documented steps, by accelerating its enrichment program. By early 2026, Iran was enriching uranium to around 60% purity, a fraction of weapons grade, but far above any threshold justified by civilian nuclear energy. The IAEA's own inspection reports documented this trajectory. The enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordow were not the infrastructure of a country building medical isotopes. They were the infrastructure of a country that had decided the threshold between latency and a weapon was a political choice, not a technical limit. Washington saw it, and in the early weeks of 2026, it moved. U.S. envoys conducted 3 rounds of negotiations with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in Geneva. The talks collapsed. Vice President J.D. Vance summarized the impasse with surgical precision. Why was Iran building enrichment facilities 70 feet underground if the goal was civilian nuclear power? That question had no civilian answer. On February 28, 2026, at approximately 7 a.m. local time, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. Nearly 900 strikes in the first 12 hours targeted Iranian missiles, air defenses, military infrastructure, and leadership. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening hours. The Iranian nuclear sites at Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan sustained what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs described as extremely severe damage. The strikes also targeted administrative hubs, dual-use scientific research facilities, and, according to initial reports, the Iran Atomic Energy Agency headquarters in Tehran. It was the most concentrated counter-proliferation strike in history, and it had a consequence that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had warned about before the first missile left its tube. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. On March 4th, Iran officially declared the strait closed and threatened to attack any ship that attempted to transit it. The IRGC Navy, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, did not issue an empty warning. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Center reported 10 attacks on ships in the strait by March 8th alone, with 5 crew members killed on 2 vessels. Sea mines went into the water. By March 2nd, no tankers in the strait were broadcasting automatic identification system signals, indicating near-zero traffic. The choke point that carries around 20% of the world's oil trade and a significant share of global liquefied natural gas volumes had gone silent in 72 hours. What happened next to the global economy was not a surprise to anyone who had studied the architecture of the world's energy system. It was the realization of a risk that analysts had been modeling and governments had been ignoring for decades. The numbers came fast. Brent crude surged 10 to 13% to around $80 to $82 per barrel by March 2. That was the first rung. By March 8th, Brent crossed $100 per barrel for the first time in 4 years. By March 19th, Dubai crude hit a record $166 per barrel. The largest ever monthly increase in oil prices in recorded history occurred in March 2026. These were not market tremors. They were structural fractures. The oil production of Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates collectively dropped by a reported 6.7 million barrels per day by March 10th, and by at least 10 million barrels per day by March 12th, because the strait through which their exports move was mined, blockaded, and under active military interdiction. Qatar Energy, the world's largest LNG exporter, declared force majeure on all exports. The Gulf Cooperation Council's economic model, export oil through Hormuz, import food through Hormuz, fund a welfare state from the proceeds, had stopped functioning. Asia felt it first. In 2024, around 84% of the crude oil and 83% of the LNG passing through the strait went to Asia. Nearly 70% of that oil went to China, India, Japan, and South Korea. When the strait closed, the supply lines of the world's largest manufacturing economies severed simultaneously. Bangladesh, Pakistan, Vietnam. Universities closed in advance for Eid al-Fitr to conserve electricity and fuel. Shopping centers were ordered to shut by 8 p.m. The Philippines declared a state of emergency on March 24th. Jet fuel in North America spiked 95% since the war began, causing multiple airlines to raise prices for checked baggage. The U.S. Postal Service, Amazon, and FedEx implemented fuel surcharges. In California, gasoline crossed $5 per gallon. These were not distant geopolitical abstractions. They were receipts. Every pump, every checkout, every shipping invoice, carrying the cost of a nuclear negotiation that failed in Geneva in February. Europe's exposure ran on a different clock, but it ran deeper. The conflict coincided with historically low European gas storage levels, estimated at just 30% capacity following a harsh 2025-2026 winter. Dutch TTF gas benchmarks nearly doubled to over $60 per megawatt-hour by mid-March. The European Central Bank postponed its planned interest rate reductions on March 19th, raising its 2026 inflation forecast and cutting GDP growth projections. Economists warned that energy-intensive economies faced high risks of technical recession if the maritime blockade persisted through the summer refill season. UK inflation was projected to breach 5% in 2026. Chemical and steel manufacturers in the UK and the EU imposed surcharges of up to 30% on industrial output to offset surging electricity costs. The war in Iran had become a European energy crisis without a single European soldier being involved. That is the architecture of the modern global energy system. Perfectly efficient in peace, catastrophically fragile under pressure. The food dimension received almost no attention in the first weeks. It should have. Over 30% of global urea, the fertilizer produced from natural gas and essential to corn and wheat production, is exported from Gulf countries through the strait. The Food Policy Institute warned of long-term food price increases. The maritime blockade triggered a concurrent grocery supply emergency across Gulf Cooperation Council states, which rely on the strait for over 80% of their caloric intake. By mid-March, 70% of the region's food imports were disrupted, forcing retailers to airlift staples and causing a 40 to 120% spike in consumer food prices. Iranian strikes on desalination plants, the source of 99% of drinking water in Kuwait and Qatar, shifted the crisis from fiscal contraction toward humanitarian emergency. Vitol CEO Russell Hardy stated on April 21st that 1 billion barrels of oil production would ultimately be lost because of the war, with current losses already between 600 and 700 million barrels. That is a number without historical precedent. The 1973 OPEC embargo removed roughly 4.3 million barrels per day from markets. What happened in March 2026 removed more than twice that, and it did so with no warning, no phased reduction, and no political off-ramp prepared. The nuclear strikes themselves produced a strategic paradox that no one in the Trump administration had publicly resolved. A classified Defense Intelligence Agency assessment found the nuclear strikes set Iran's program back by less than 6 months rather than eliminating it. CIA Director John Ratcliffe disputed that assessment, claiming severe damage that would take years to rebuild. Approximately 50% of Iran's missile launchers remained intact according to U.S. intelligence as of April 2026. The IRGC Navy retained roughly 50% of its pre-war assets, and there was a deeper calculation that the Arms Control Association surfaced directly. The strikes may have strengthened the political case within Iran for nuclear weaponization rather than weakened it, a strategic irony of the First Order. The fatwa, the religious edict issued by Ali Khamenei prohibiting nuclear weapons, died with him on February 28. The IRGC-dominated leadership that replaced him faces no such constraint. The nuclear question has shifted fundamentally. The new leadership faces a strategic choice between maintaining conventional deterrence and pursuing weaponization. Operation Epic Fury was launched to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. The outcome of the operation has created an Iran whose new leaders have both the motivation and, according to multiple assessments, the surviving technical infrastructure to revisit that decision on their own terms. The diplomacy as of this week reflects the true cost of that paradox. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated on May 5, 2026 that Operation Epic Fury had effectively ended, and that the United States had shifted to a defensive posture focused on restoring commercial transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Trump himself described the negotiating position with characteristic directness. Iran's economy is collapsing, inflation is close to 100%, and the blockade is preventing $500 million per day in oil revenue. The U.S. offer on the table, enriched uranium for civilian medical purposes, provided free in exchange for abandoning the nuclear program, was declined. Iran's anonymous officials told Press TV the country would end the war when it decided to, and on its own conditions. Israel's foreign minister has stated that securing Iran's enriched nuclear material is a precondition for ending the conflict. As of late April, the International Maritime Organization reported approximately 20,000 mariners and 2,000 ships stranded in the Persian Gulf. The strait that carries a fifth of the world's oil remains, right now, effectively closed. The world's energy system has one throat. It is 21 miles wide, guarded by the same institution that forced Iran's supreme leader election at gunpoint, and closed by a decision made in an enrichment facility buried 70 feet underground. Every dollar at the pump, every delayed cargo, every postponed rate cut in Frankfurt and London traces back to the same origin point. A negotiation in Geneva that failed, a weapon that was never built but was always being built toward, and a strait that everyone knew was the pressure valve for the entire global economy. The question isn't whether it can be reopened. The question is what Iran will demand in exchange, and whether what they demand is something the world is willing to give.